The harbour lights of Singapore were supposed to be untouchable. Too far, too guarded, too deep inside the Japanese perimeter. A place where ships slept under searchlights and guns, and every shadow belonged to someone who would kill you for stepping wrong. But in September 1943, 14 men decided to go anyway. Not in a warship, not in a submarine. In a small wooden vessel disguised as a local fishing boat. Slow, vulnerable, ordinary enough to be ignored. And they were betting their lives on that ordinariness, because this wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be an intrusion. A quiet, surgical violation of the most defended kind of space. A port, at war, under occupation. The plan had a simple spine. Sail into the region as if you belong. Get close without being noticed. Then, when the night turns thick and the city's breath settles, paddle into the harbour in collapsible canoes and attach limpet mines to Japanese ships like you're pinning a message to steel. Then disappear, not in triumph, in silence. It began in a world far from Singapore's bright waters. Australia. A continent that felt safe compared to the Pacific front until it didn't. By 1942, the war had moved close enough that distance stopped being protection. And inside Allied planning, a new kind of organization started forming, part intelligence, part sabotage, part desperation. Special Operations Australia. A structure under the Allied Intelligence Bureau umbrella, drawing on men who could operate without flags, without parades, without the reassurance of a conventional unit behind them. Within that, a small commando arm emerged, Z Special Unit, the kind of outfit built for missions nobody wanted to authorize on paper. Because on paper, they looked like suicide. In the middle of this, a British officer named Ivan Lyon shaped an idea that felt insane precisely because it was so practical. If you can't break into a harbour with force, break into it with disguise. If you can't bring explosives in by ship, bring them in by canoe. And if you want to hit the Japanese where it hurts most, hit their shipping, their movement, their logistics, their confidence. The core concept was not new in history, but the setting made it cruel. Singapore was occupied, watched. Japanese patrol craft moved like teeth around the coastline. Any vessel that didn't belong could be questioned, boarded, sunk. So Leon's plan depended on something fragile, passing as ordinary. That's where the boat comes in. It wasn't built for glory. It was a captured vessel, renamed MV Crate. Wooden hull, fishing boat profile, the kind of craft that could blend into tropical waters if you held your nerve and played your part. And the men aboard would need to commit to the disguise completely, not just the shape of the boat, everything. What you wear, how you move, what language your posture speaks, even what rubbish you throw overboard, because a trail of European scraps in Asian waters could be the smallest clue that gets you killed. Training didn't happen on parade grounds. It happened in hidden places where the coastline was quiet and the water could teach you how unforgiving it was. They trained with full-boats, collapsible canoes that could be carried, assembled, and launched without announcing themselves. You had to learn how they behaved under load, how they sounded when you shifted your weight, how they responded to wind and chop. Because out there, the enemy wasn't just Japanese patrols. It was the sea. It was fatigue. It was the human tendency to make noise when you're cold, wet, and scared. 14 men. A mixed team, British and Australian personnel, from the Australian Imperial Force and the Royal Australian Navy, operating under Z Special Unit. The number matters because it tells you what this mission really was. Not an army, a blade. And on a small vessel, a blade has nowhere to hide. When Crate left Western Australia, the ocean was a long, indifferent stretch of risk. Weeks of sailing where every horizon line could carry a patrol vessel, where every mechanical problem could strand you within sight of someone who would ask questions you couldn't answer. The boat was slow. It suffered engine trouble during the voyage. Exactly the kind of failure that becomes lethal when you're pretending to be harmless. And yet that slowness was part of the disguise. Warships hurry. Fishing boats don't. A fishing boat can drift without raising suspicion. A fishing boat can look lost or tired or broken without triggering immediate alarm if the enemy wants to believe it. And the enemy often does want to believe the easy story. Day after day, the men lived inside their roles. Your voice changes when you're afraid, so you speak less. Your face changes when you're exhausted, so you let the sun and salt roughen you. You learn the discipline of not looking like you're watching, because the most suspicious thing a disguised man can do is look alert. On the approach toward enemy-controlled waters, the psychological pressure thickens. Every distant engine note becomes a test. Every silhouette on the horizon becomes a decision. Alter course, hold course, or freeze and hope. At night, the sea looks like ink and broken stars. The air smells of salt and fuel and damp wood. You can hear the hull creak soft, constant noises that become strangely intimate because you know how quiet you have to be if someone comes close. There's a moment on missions like this where you realize the paradox. The closer you get to the target, the more normal you have to look. Not tense, not ready, not like men about to strike. Just like men trying to make a living on the water. That's why disguise is such a brutal art. It demands the opposite of what your nerves want. And then, finally, Singapore comes nearer. Not the skyline you imagine in tourist photographs. The edges first. The sense of land as a darker mass against the night. The idea that every coastal light may be Japanese. The awareness that you're now operating inside a predator's territory. The team staged near a small island close enough to be a launch point, but far enough to stay hidden. A forward base. Not a campfire. Not comfort. A place to breathe quietly before stepping into the harbour itself. This is the hinge of Operation Jaywick. The point where the sea voyage ends and the real intrusion begins. Because now the plan becomes intimate. Now it's not 14 men on a boat. It's a handful of men in canoes, paddling in darkness towards ships that are guarded by soldiers with rifles. This is where small sounds become destiny. The soft dip of a paddle blade, the faint drip of water from the paddle as you lift it, the creak of a canoe frame under weight, the involuntary cough you have to swallow until it hurts, and in the distance, the harbour. Singapore Harbour wasn't just water and ships, it was a machine. Patrol patterns, lights, routines. The Japanese ran it like a living organism, watchful, reactive, capable of violence in seconds. Leon selected 6 men to go in from the forward base. 6, because 6 could move quietly enough to slip between attention. 6 could split up, attach mines, regroup. 6 could still vanish if everything went wrong if they were lucky. They assembled the foal boats and pushed into the black water. The canoes were small and low. That's the point. But low means every ripple feels enormous, and every wake from a passing vessel feels like a threat. As they paddled, they watched the water for reflections, because a searchlight doesn't always have to hit you directly to reveal you. Sometimes it's enough that the beam catches the ripple you made. Sometimes the harbour tells on you even when no one's looking your way. They move toward the anchored ships with a kind of patience that isn't calm. It's controlled terror. Because the closer you get, the more you hear. Metal clicks. Distant voices. A chain shifting. A soft thud as someone on deck moves a crate. The sense that the harbour is full of waking eyes, even if you can't see them. This is where whisper-like dialogue becomes less about drama and more about survival. A breath into the dark. Hold. Another breath. Now. Not shouted, not even spoken, really more like air, shaped into a hint of meaning. Because sound travels over water, and men with rifles have excellent hearing when they're nervous. The mines themselves were the mission's heart. Limpet mines small, attached directly to hulls, designed to detonate later. The act of placing one is not heroic. It's delicate, hands on wet metal, feeling for rivets and plates. Trying to work fast without splashing, without scraping, without letting the mine clack against the hull like a dropped tool, because the hull is a drum, and the harbour is a room. Attach. Secure. Move. Then back into darkness. They split, moving from ship to ship in the way you move through a place you have no right to be. Quickly, quietly, leaving behind something that doesn't belong. And at some point, as the work continues, you feel the harrowing truth of sabotage. You are close enough to your target that you could touch it, but you can't fight it. If you're spotted, you don't win a firefight. You die. Or you're captured. And in Japanese-occupied Singapore, capture meant things worse than death. So the men did not linger. They did not admire what they were doing. They did not allow themselves the luxury of pride. They planted the mines and slipped away, paddling back toward their hiding place with arms that now felt heavier, slower, as if the harbour had attached its own weight to their bodies. Behind them, the ships sat quietly in the water. No alarms, no sirens, nothing dramatic. Just steel, darkness, and the delayed certainty of what had been placed against those hulls. And now came the most dangerous phase. Waiting. Because after you strike in secret, you have to let time do the loud part. You have to lie still, while a city goes on breathing above you, unaware that the harbour has been booby-trapped by men who aren't supposed to be there. The team returned to their forward base near the island, exhausted, salt-stiff, hands raw from paddling and handling wet gear. They didn't celebrate, they listened. Because now, every sound from Singapore carried a question. Did anyone see? Did anyone suspect? Did any patrol craft alter course? Did any searchlight sweep in a new pattern? In the dark, you can feel the difference between routine and alarm even before you see it. The night holds its breath when something is wrong. They lay low. They waited for the mines to do what mines do. And somewhere, inside the harbour, under those ships, time ticked toward the moment when steel would finally scream. The first explosion didn't sound like a battle. It sounded like a mistake. A deep, muffled concussion that rolled across the water and arrived late, as if even sound was trying to stay unnoticed. Then another, then another. Singapore Harbour, so confident in its lights and patrol routines, suddenly flinched. In the darkness near their hiding place, the raiders didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just listened, rigid, eyes on the black line of the city, feeling the air change as the harbour woke up confused and angry. Across the water, searchlights snapped alive like blades. White beams swept the surface, fast and frantic, catching spray and foam, turning harmless ripples into suspicious movement. A siren started somewhere near the docks and then cut off, replaced by shouted orders, sharp, clipped voices that carried over the water in bursts. Somewhere metal rang out, distant and hollow, like a ship's hull being struck with a hammer. A few seconds later, the harbour gave them the confirmation they'd been waiting for. Fire, a low glow that shouldn't have been there. Then a taller column of flame, climbing into the night, painting smoke orange. From the island hide, the men could see silhouettes of ships shifting awkwardly big shapes that were never meant to move quickly, now drifting under their own damaged weight. The mines had done what mines do. They made steel feel fragile. By morning, the story inside Singapore would become chaos. Japanese patrol boats racing, harbour control shouting, men scrambling to figure out how this had happened inside what they believed was a sealed perimeter. The results were real enough to be measured. Multiple ships sunk and damaged, a sudden loss of tonnage and confidence right where the Japanese didn't expect to be touched. And the most dangerous part of that success was its silence. Because the raiders were already gone. No commandos on the wharf, no smoking gun, no bodies to display, just wreckage and questions. That kind of attack doesn't only damage ships, it damages certainty. And uncertainty is contagious in a garrison town. The 6 men stayed hidden, letting the first wave of panic burn itself out. Hours passed. Then a day, then another. Every minute they remained near the harbour was a minute inside a tightening web. Because after an attack like this, the hunt begins. The Japanese didn't think in terms of a fishing boat slipping across open sea from Australia. It sounded too audacious, too improbable, too humiliating. So the suspicion turned inward. If the harbour had been sabotaged, then someone inside Singapore must have helped. Someone local, someone connected, someone they could punish. And punishment under occupation was a language the Japanese military police spoke fluently. Out on the island, the men could feel the net being cast. They saw more boats moving at odd hours. More lights on the water. More search patterns that didn't look like routine. They heard distant engines at night, lingering longer, making slow, methodical sweeps. This was the trap that came after success. The environment changes. Your exit route is no longer the same route you came in on. So they waited for the harbour to settle back into its habits, just enough for them to slip away without creating a second mystery. And then, when the timing felt right, they began the return. Paddling again, but now with the added weight of pursuit in the back of the mind. Back across the water to the rendezvous. Back to the point where Crate would be waiting like a shadow that had learned to float. The paddleback isn't cinematic, it's punishing. Salt dries on your skin and turns it tight. Your hands swell and then go numb. Your shoulders burn. You're not thinking about medals. You're thinking about one thing. Don't be seen. Because now, after the explosions, every patrol is alert, and every guard believes the enemy is nearby. They reached Crate and hauled the foalboats aboard, with the urgency of men who know a second of delay can cost everything. Then the boat slipped away from the islands and out into open water again, back into the long, quiet risk of crossing seas that didn't belong to them. This was the phase where the disguise mattered most. Before the attack, a fishing boat moving through the region might be ignored. After the attack, any fishing boat could be a suspect, and that meant the crew had to perform normal, harder than ever. No sudden course changes, no panic, no unnatural speed, just a small boat moving as if it had no knowledge of what the harbour had become behind it. Days later, in the Lombok Strait, the mission nearly died in the most understated way possible. A Japanese vessel approached close enough to make the world narrow, close enough that you could imagine faces on the other deck, eyes narrowed, deciding whether this craft belonged. Close enough that the men on Crate had to keep their bodies relaxed and their movements slow because fear is obvious when you're trying to hide it. The boat wasn't challenged, not then, not that day. And when it finally passed, leaving only wake lines and fading engine noise, the men didn't exhale loudly. They didn't speak. They just let the tension drain out of their muscles in silence, because even relief could feel like noise if you weren't careful. When Crate finally returned to Australia back to Exmouth Gulf, the journey ended without ceremony. No parade on the beach, no crowds, just men stepping off a small vessel that looked like it had never done anything remarkable in its life. That was the point. A successful clandestine raid doesn't end with applause. It ends with the world pretending nothing happened, while the people who did it carry the memory like a private weight. Operation Jaywick, on its face, was a near-perfect mission. Infiltrate. Strike. Extract. No casualties among the raiders. But history rarely allows clean endings, because the ripples of that night in Singapore didn't stay in the water. They moved through the city. They moved through the occupying force. And they found innocent people. In October 1943, the Japanese military police, the Kenpeitai, began arrests and interrogations tied to their desperate need to explain the sabotage. They took civilians. They took internees. They took men and women who had nothing to do with the raid, but who fit the story the Japanese needed to believe, that the attack must have been helped from inside Singapore. The interrogations were not interrogations in the modern, neat sense of the word. They were brutality disguised as investigation. Beatings. Starvation. Methods designed not to find truth, but to force a confession that would satisfy the hunger for an answer. Some of those taken never returned, and when the number of dead is counted, it lands like a quiet indictment. People killed for a crime they didn't commit, punished because an operation was too bold for the occupiers to imagine from outside. This is the shadow Jaywick cast. The part that doesn't fit easily into the neat frame of successful raid. Because war doesn't keep consequences neatly attached to the men who earn them. Sometimes consequences spill outward. Sometimes they land on people who never agreed to be part of the story. For the men of Jaywick, this knowledge became a kind of second mission, one they never volunteered for. How do you hold pride and grief in the same hand? How do you measure success when the enemy responds by hurting innocents? There is no clean arithmetic for that. And yet, in the logic of wartime decision-making, the raid's success created another kind of temptation. If one impossible operation worked, why not try again? Because that's how boldness becomes doctrine. And doctrine, once proven, starts demanding repetition. Jaywick was the proof of concept that a small team could penetrate the heart of Japanese power in Southeast Asia and strike shipping in a harbour that was supposed to be secure. It embarrassed the enemy. It disrupted logistics. It showed the Allies could reach farther than the Japanese believed. And it also lit a dangerous flame in the minds of planners. A belief that the same trick could be performed twice. Even when the conditions had changed, even when the enemy was now awake. Because after Jaywick, Singapore wasn't the same. After Jaywick, the Japanese were watching their harbour with different eyes. After Jaywick, a fishing boat wasn't just a fishing boat anymore, and that is the final tension of this story. Jaywick succeeded because it was unexpected. Its greatest weapon wasn't explosives. It was audacity hidden behind normality. Once that normality becomes suspicious, the knife gets harder to conceal. So Operation Jaywick lives in a narrow space in history, a perfect raid in execution, a complex legacy in consequence, a demonstration of what small teams can do when they're willing to move through enemy territory with nothing but disguise, discipline, and silence. And a reminder that the loudest part of special operations is not the explosion. It's what happens after the explosion when the enemy starts looking for someone to blame, and the world around the target pays the price. The harbour lights of Singapore were not untouchable. They were simply waiting for someone patient enough to reach them. And in 1943, 14 men did. Then they vanished back into the sea, leaving behind wreckage and a question that would haunt the occupation for months. If this can happen here, in the most guarded waters, what else is possible?